Longest day of the most daylight hours. Um, and welcome back. It's great to see you. I wonder if you're as warm as I am. I'm in the upstairs part of my house, and it's really warm here. But the thing is that becoming involved in giving the talk, most likely I won't even notice in a minute. So a number of you have turned out for the first meeting of our summer book club on My Grandmother's Hands. That book is subtitled Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And that so many of you turned out says that what matters at the moment to so many of us is race, trauma, and healing. It can be racial trauma, or it can be family trauma, but we're really waking up to the effects on our health and our ability to relate to each other and to people who are different from us is so affected by our history, the trauma history. Our approach to all of this tonight is to consider karma, and more specifically collective karma that we all are part of. We all receive, maintain, and contribute to. And we're all the product of decisions made and lives lived out before our time, and all during our lifespan. And so it's important to look into the meaning and develop a view that includes awareness of collective karma as we engage a life of practice. Using the word collective when talking about karma is almost redundant, since karma is a collective phenomenon. That may not be the original teaching about karma, which was more looking at the individual's responsibility and how it plays out in our future. But for our purposes today, we're examining the collectivity of our endless twisted karma and how it affects our ability to wake up and to contribute to the world at large and the ongoing expression of what a human life can be. So one question that I ask is, do you know your history? This is beyond just the natal family that you grew up in. How far back? How much do you know about your history? In Zen, we focus particularly usually upon present moment experience, which is, of course, the only experience. We are perpetually in this moment, where everything in our lives happens. But the conditioning that we bring forward and that we're constantly affected by comes down to us through millennia of conditions and causes, and is carried in the body that has been passed from one generation to the next genetically, carrying with it all the biological and energetic effects that were enacted and brought about in past times, in past bodies. Modern studies are looking at how plastic our genetic makeup is, in that behavior affects gene expression, and gene expression is influenced by experience and behavior and trauma. The cells are handed down and express the chemistry of our history. the chemistry of our ancestors, which then also has effects on how it feels to be us right now. The chemistry contributing to our own experience and responses to things. Collective karma is our bioinheritance. Body and mind are not separate. Past, present, and future are not separate. So that's kind of the view I want to open up about tonight, and what we work on when we're looking at the effects of racial trauma and our history, our own personal history of trauma. Most of us are white, and so we may know a lot less about our trauma histories than if we were people of color. So I want to bring it up because the more we look into it, the more we begin to discover how profoundly we're affected by what happened generations ago. So think about what happens in the womb to a developing human being as the mother lives her pregnancy out. During a wanted pregnancy, your mother is loved and supported by her people, has enough to eat, meets each day with a kind of confidence that she's safe and healthy. The child in the womb, therefore, will be bathed in a certain hormone bath, which is part of the forming cells. Consider a different biological karma of a forming human who's in the womb of a woman who's been raped and sold and is hungry and isn't safe and is constantly anxious and under physical and emotional threat, or is stoned with drugs and alcohol. What is that developing human being bathed in? Right from the very start of this life. And what was it like for you? Do you know about the circumstances of that your mother was living in when she was pregnant with you? All of us came into unique bio wombs, surrounded by and affected by the sounds and energies that our mother was living through during her pregnancy. And then we emerged into unique family circumstances that then continued to unfold through our developmental course and has brought us down to this moment. There's a koan that asks, what was your face before your parents were born? So there's the aspect of this koan that deals with original nature. What is our essential nature? What do you know of this for yourself? What direct awareness and experience do you have with what lies underneath the individual personality and historical self? This is one thing that we're investigating in our minds and our bodies as we sit. To get this kind of clarity and be able to live from this source of freedom, we need to explore the karmic threads that entangle and obscure our experience of the freshness and openness of each moment. What distracts us? What do we believe about ourselves and the world that really has been laid on top of and that we've inherited, or conclusions we've come to about what this moment is composed of? How alive do you feel? If we've been hammered for generations by difficulties and abuse, our ability to be vital and open and have satisfying and mutual relationships will be severely constrained. Our view about what's going on right here and now is drenched in past experience and the conclusions that we or our ancestors have drawn from it all. So to know ourselves is a journey without limit. The self that seeks refuge and peace and wisdom may utter a wee small voice through the din of karma that lands us in Zen practice. What brought us here? What motivates us? Wanting to be relieved of painful karma that we may identify with, so that we're able, once relieved of this karma, once being aware of the karma overlay and infusion, so that we can live with the freedom that's also a possibility. And that freedom is spiritual freedom. Spiritual freedom doesn't necessarily free us from worldly difficulties. This is what the First Noble Truth teaches us. But it does influence how we receive and respond to these difficulties. If we're deeply suffering and we are imprisoned in a self that seems quite alone and up against a world out there, imprisoned in the individual self, that's one way. When we're free, then the body of the entire world accompanies us in each moment, intimately, mysteriously, in amongst the ordinary. It's all in the ordinary world. So with practice, our mind states are no longer clutched into just a narrow band of misery. But nonetheless, sometimes we get the miseries. I don't know about you, I do. Sometimes in the middle of the night can be a pretty miserable time. Or just any old time. We can have the miseries. But if you have a strong ongoing practice, you know you have the miseries. And that makes all the difference when you realize, oh yeah, this is the suffering self. This is me suffering. This is how I suffer. It's like I noticed at one point in my practice that there are certain thoughts that occur to me that I call torture thoughts. They pop up and I torture myself with these thoughts. You could say this is one example is the inner critic. It's a tormentor. But to know what it is, makes all the difference. So thinking about what conditions allow us to thrive or help us to thrive. And when I say thrive, I mean spiritually thrive. Spiritual thriving isn't subject to change. You know, that question of what changes and what does not change. It's a wonderful practice koan. We can look at that. What changes and what does not change? What do we know for ourselves about that? Because spiritual thriving isn't dependent on conditions. If we don't practice and only rely on improving the conditions in the world, then we're trapped in a hungry ghost realm. We can never be fed. Because conditions change constantly and are infinite in variety and are mostly out of our control. They are enacted in this realm of collective karma. So if this is what we're caught up in, then there's just more of the same. It's an endless wheel of samsara. But in the way of our practice, we can be thriving in the deepest way of freedom. Even when we're having a hard time, we can be okay. And maybe some of you know exactly what that means. Even when things are really hard, basically everything is all right. And we confront severe conditions. When we confront severe conditions that stir up old trauma, which might be true in our Tuesday night class, looking at some of this can really stir us up. our own trauma, our ancestors, and our neighbors' trauma. So we have in our practice an opportunity to purify karma by being aware. What does this phrase mean? Is that a line from Hakuin Zenji's Song of Zazen, purifying karma, dissolving obstructions. And the way that we dissolve obstructions is by becoming aware of them. It's really as simple as that, actually. Becoming aware of what gets in our way of being fully present and not disregarding it, but looking into it and working with it, taking it on and saying, okay, what about this? So we do that. We become aware of our own obstructions. That's the work we're doing in confronting racial karma. And it helps us lend a hand to be able to live for the benefit of all sentient beings. But we have to do our work. It's not about getting really busy in the world, although that can grow from our work. But doing our own inner work really is essential if we're going to transform the energy that we bring into this life. So, Zazen. In Zazen, we don't do anything. We just sit and notice experience. Anything and everything that comes up in our mind-body stream. All of our karma is to be seen in this mind-body stream. And then it plays out in our lives. Looking into our family history and cultural history, the individuals who are our biological forebears, as well as the worlds that they were situated in, we come to understand the forces that work on us, that we act out over and over and over again. And the more aware we are of them, the more choices we have. We can choose differently how to respond. Then automatically being in the thrall of karmic patterns that undermine our clarity and open-heartedness. So it's really important to go beyond our own story. A story that we may have told over and over and over in our lives. We all have those stories we tell over and over and over. And to look more deeply and broadly into the karmic stream that we've been swept up in. And I say stream, but it's really many, many streams, rivers, oceans of karma. Because first of all, we each had two parents, whether we lived with them or not, whether we knew them or not. So there's two right away. Then we have teachers, and we have siblings, and we have communities we've lived in, and teachers we've had, and pets we've had. I mean, there are just so many forces of influence that make it possible to wake up. And I think of the Buddha and the karma that his life expressed. We all were born in very specific karmic frames. So there he was a prince. He was beloved, he was beautiful, he was kind and sensitive and smart. All these conditions helped him to realize liberation, and allowed him to tune into and be aware of his own experience, not just what he was told about it, but what he experienced. And also to follow his own nose, to follow his own guidance. In each juncture of his life, first, he had his own questions. He followed the teachings of a number of cultural religious teachers. but he still wasn't satisfied. So Aitken Roshi used to emphasize that, and he would point out that the Buddha must have had a very strong ego, a very strong sense of self, or he would not have been able to clarify to the extent that he did and share it the way he did so widely. And his confidence, the confidence that he had, grew from his connection with his own experience, which is why in our practice, we really stress, what is your direct experience? What is it? And become friendly with it, friendly with yourself, not guarding against and being ashamed and not having to hide out, but feeling empowered by the inner permission that we need to grant ourselves, no matter how many people grant it to you, until you grant that permission to yourself, it cannot be in effect. Permission to be yourself, to tell your truth. So this is the healing that comes with Dharma practice. Even if we don't start out with all the privileges and advantages that the Buddha had. And there are many stories of enlightened beings who grew up in really difficult circumstances. We can all dissolve the obstructions to our own freedom in the moment and find our way to healing to some extent. It's in keeping with the Bodhisattva vow to do our healing so that we can bring healing to others just by the way we are. Bring teaching just by the way we are in the world. The feeling of being around us can be healing without any verbal instruction. You should guard against instructing others. And the more we do our own inner work, the more we no longer maintain or add our own trauma and its effects to the trauma of the world. This is what we can do. This is what we're doing in our practice. To know our own path that was set out even before we were born. What events in the world were unfolding when you were conceived. My daughter, a couple of years ago for my birthday, went to the newspapers of the day I was born and printed out the headlines and also the page of movies that were playing at the time. Because when my mother went into labor, it was the hottest day of the summer. She and my father were in a movie theater just to keep cool because they air conditioned the theater. So one of those movies was playing when I began to emerge. So what were your parents experiencing? How were they doing in their lives? How empowered or disempowered were they to attend to their own needs as they grew up? And how much did they need to ignore or escape in order to fit into their world? Each parent brought with them their own streams of karma, their gifts and liabilities. How were they thought of in their families? How were they labeled in their communities? What were their attitudes towards others and towards you, towards money, towards sex, towards gender, towards social justice and the natural environment, and towards religion or spiritual life? These are just a very few categories that we use to label the karmic forces that create our experience of what we say reality is, what we think reality is. What was going on in the world when your parents were born and their parents? What brought them to this country? And where did they land here? And do you even know? It's not uncommon for immigrants fleeing war and famine and persecution and the law, or their families and customs, to never talk about it once they get here. So do you come from a family that doesn't talk about upsetting things? Or perhaps you come from a family that only talks about upset and then keeps it going. So that's all we know when we're growing up, is carrying grudges and prejudices and fears and put downs and being disempowered, or else being privileged. So out of all this, a certain voice can predominate until we notice it and realize that there are other voices that we can draw on. There are other views and other aspects of our experience. And what we do with all this brings us to the Bodhisattva vow. So what is so ingrained that we're not aware of it? Like privilege, for instance. Some of us really identify with being privileged. Some of us did not grow up feeling very privileged, although we benefited from whiteness, from being white. But there were way more difficulties going on. So it didn't feel like a privileged early life. So all of this leads to how we show up in the world. And our very action vibrates in all directions. When you're awake, when I'm awake, when we are awake to the ways in which our actions are predetermined, we can act as a dampener for these karmic vibrations. When we become aware that suffering is being enacted through us, we can stop it. We can save people downstream and calm the network and improve conditions for everyone. So that's a bit of a few words, few thousand words about collective karma, which is, we are reading a book that deals with it. We have a practice that looks into it. And every moment of the day, we can become aware of it. We can use that as our guiding practice, is what karmic forces are being revealed right now. Like, how much water are you using? I mean, there are so many different ways to look at this. How many things do we take for granted? It's all a result of our conditioning, our expectations. So may we all really become wise and open and bring benefit through how we live our lives. Thank you.